Hey everyone, Ali Alberigo here from Long Island Ninjutsu Centers and taking it to the next level, which is my coaching business that I have. Anyway, I'm talking to you today as a martial art instructor, of course, as the Yoshihan or, practicing martial artist of my school. And I just want to talk about the topic of traditional martial arts. Now, first and foremost, for those martial arts students that are listening, you could think of yourself, if you're training in any martial art, there's different levels of traditionalism. Really most importantly, what I want to clarify is that tradition is nothing more than something that's been going on for a period of time. It could be simply how you make a ham and you cook something in the oven. I'm going to tell you a quick story about that. There was a young girl, probably in her teens, and she was excited on Thanksgiving to actually finally get a chance to cook the Thanksgiving ham. And she went to her mom at the time to cook, and she says, Mom, tell me all the secrets of why you cook the ham. Why do you cut the ends off on the ham and slice it? And she says, well, I'm not really positive, but I did it because my mom did it. But the great news is you could go and speak to her right now. Go speak to Grandma. So the young teenager went and spoke to Grandma, and she said, Grandma, why do we cut the ends of the ham off? And she said, the grandmother replied and said, you know what? I'm not really exactly sure. That's the way my mom taught me. But fortunately, great-grandma is here. So she went to great-grandma, finally asked her, great-grandma, why do you cut the ends of the ham off? Why do we do it that way? My mom said she did it because you did it. She said to ask grandma. I asked grandma. She said she did it because you did it. And now I'm asking you. And can you give me an insight on how and why we do it? She basically turned to her great-granddaughter and said, simply because when I was cooking ham, when we were younger, and your great-grandfather and I had just gotten married, we had a very small house and a very small stove with very small pans, and I couldn't fit the whole ham in the pan. So I had to cut the ends off and cook them separately. So there you go. There's tradition. It doesn't necessarily mean that the tradition has to be valuable. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a reason for it. Sometimes it's as simple as not having enough space. Why do we do a certain thing within a certain school? And the traditions may not be rooted in some ancient philosophy, ancient history, ancient culture, and martial virtue. Now, with that being said, I do want to say there are so many traditions that are so valuable, that are so important to the real nuts and bolts, the core, the ruha, the family, and the actual essence of the martial arts. I think lately, the traditional martial arts are being lost, and sadly, and this comes from my business coaching as well, sadly, traditional martial arts school owners are giving up, thinking that they can't be who they are. They have to sell out to some new fad gimmick or scam or idea to be able to be successful and make a living and feed their family. So I want you to know that as a traditional martial artist, you do not have to close down your school, shut down your program, start a new fandangled next gimmick that comes around type system. Traditional values are still desired by hundreds of thousands of people within our world. Millions and millions of people care about what we do and the real roots of what we teach. So traditional martial arts, in my opinion, and of course we'll go into the technical thing, but the traditional martial arts is teaching you not only the physical application, right, but the mental application and the spiritual application. The things that make us stronger as a person in whole. The traditional martial arts are actual techniques that were used in combat. Now, of course, combat changed slightly. We went from having a sword or a club, or a stick or a bow and arrow to having AR-15s and, Glocks and guns and the technologies changed, the people who you're fighting against have become more advanced. So there are some things in tradition that may not work. But then if you look at the tradition in itself, for example, we teach bokken and sword. We teach biken jitsu in our school. There are people who've come to me and said, why would I need to learn how to use a sword? What's the sense of it all? Now, there was one time, probably within the last 15 years, that some guy was a crazy sword-wielding crazy man in the subway in New York City, and he was cutting people up with his sword, and the only person that was able to stop him, even the police, I don't believe, got to him, was a jiu-jitsu player who was able to take the sword and disarm it. He had trained in those arts. Now, the sword could be a pipe, the pipe could be a knife, the knife could be a box cutter. All of those things are all relevant to the art of the sword. But, the sword, when we practice it in our very essence, it's so much more about perfection of the mind and spirit, caring about the fine details. Because, when I cut my sword and I make that whoosh sound, if it's not just right, it won't make any sound. I've had people, masters of martial arts, come to me and say, this sword is defective. It's not making that sound that yours does. And I would kind of internally laugh and say, okay, no problem. Let's exchange it for a new sword. They'd come back and, the same process. I didn't have the heart to say, really, master so-and-so, you just need to do it right. You need to just turn it by a slight angle, slight tenth of a percent, and it'll make that whoosh sound that you're looking for. So tradition teaches us about purity of ourselves. When we learn how to be humble and we bow to our instructor and we bow inside the dojo and we show respect and protocol, things like carrying your instructor's bag for them, making sure that they eat before you do. When I was taught in Japan, we couldn't take a bite, not one morsel of food, unless our instructor ate first. We would sit there, we were starving the whole day long, and the food would come out, it's ready to go, delicious, and my instructor started telling a story. And we would sit, sometimes he'd talk for an hour, and we'd sit, and then he'd go, oh, I forgot, eat, and he'd give us permission to eat. So there are certain traditions that have such value. It teaches us how to be humble. It teaches us humility. It teaches us respect. And it teaches us about that undying dedication to your instructor, to your school, and to your art. And I have to be honest, most people are shuffling around. I've had students that train with me, and then they're not getting one application of whatever they may want. Like, for example, I have a guy that went out and he's a great grappler. And he didn't get enough grappling within my school. Although we did it, it wasn't an everyday occurrence like they do in MMA or jiu-jitsu schools. So he moved on. For quite some time, he trained in both arts, which was beautiful. But to me, it's sad because they miss out on that traditionalism. They miss out on that inner core connection. Like guys like George St. Pierre, to me, he has that core martial art ability, and he's super successful in the MMA, right? So we have to understand that tradition, number one, goes back to all the different things that happened thousands of years ago and why. The techniques themselves that worked in battle. It wasn't like, hey, I'll come up with a fancy move and I'll throw it out there and the class does it and oohs and ahs and it looks cool. No, if they did that in battle, they'd lose an arm or they'd lose their lives and it was done. They'd take that technique, they'd erase it out of the book or they'd go back and fix it. And then they would teach the ones that worked. I had an old jacket in my school when we first started my martial art dojo, and it said the best techniques are passed on by the survivors. Really, that's the only people that could tell history, the ones that lived through it, right? So we need to know the strategies, the technologies, the techniques that are taught, and we then pass them on. So tradition to me is about so much more than wearing a white or black uniform and having a belt and bowing. There are some coaches in the martial art industry that are clueless when they say that you don't have to call your instructor sensei. You don't have to wear a gi. It's just pajamas. To me, that's just absolutely ludicrous. I think it's sad that these individuals, so-called martial art masters, talk like that. Without the core, here's an example, without sauce and dough and cheese, or maybe just sauce and dough, it's not pizza. It's not core pizza, right? So you can't have something without the essence of it. You can't have a hamburger without the burger part, right? You can't just have a bun and cheese because then it's a grilled cheese, right? So I know I'm being a little silly, but at the same time, that should make sense to you. So the core martial arts, the ones that build the strongest martial arts, even the MMA fighters that I've met that I found to be incredible human beings, like people like Kung Lee and Frank Shamrock and Dan Severn, they have a traditionalism about them that it's unbelievable, especially Kung. Kung comes from a Taekwondo background, good friend of mine, great martial artist, and unbelievable. So anyway, I want you not to lose those traditions. Try to find them. And, if you're not getting them in your school, learn them. There's a great book out called Living the Martial Way. It's quite old, but quite unbelievably powerful. Forrest Morgan is, Mr. Morgan, I think, is the writer. But read that book, read about it. Also, you could check out my book, which is 21st Century Ninjutsu, A Warrior's Mindset, that I have available on Amazon.com or atouchzen.com. Anyway, thanks for listening. It's been some time since I posted. I hope this has some value to you, and I hope you enjoyed it. Arigato gozaimasu. Sayonara.